So Westar Energy, we're in the eastern third of Kansas. Now I've got about 700,000 customers, have roughly 35,000 miles of distribution and transmission line. In my role, my team, we take care of the transmission system for Westar. That includes everything 69,000 volts and above, all the big stuff. You may refer to them as high lines. And that spans from the Nebraska border down to the Oklahoma border. And then if you could draw a north-south line just on the west side of Hutchinson, back to the Missouri border is what our territory basically covers. So within that, we have about 68,000 or so wood poles on the transmission system. We have about another 3,000 to 4,000 steel poles that comprise that system. In 2016 and this year up to now, we've had 22 events. I think we're going to add a couple events to that because of fall burning, where we've had issues on the transmission system that resulted in damage or occurrences on our lines. And then we've had a few near misses with that. And when I talk about a near miss, I define a near miss as an opportunity that somebody could have got killed. So that's kind of scary to think about. And everybody asks me, well, why now? Why are you talking about this now? Well, actually, we started talking about this back in 2014. We had several events in 2014 as well because we had high fuel loads and we had kind of a dry season, and we were able to kind of spike the number of damages and of occurrences that happened on our system, and that got the attention of some of our regulators. And that's one thing we don't want to do is get the regulators involved. So some of the risks that we see and some of the risks that are out there with burning around power lines, and it doesn't matter if this is a power line that's feeding your house, feeding your barn, or feeding your neighbor's house, or feeding an entire city. One of the most prevalent things we see is flashovers. Basically what flashovers are is electricity going where you don't want it to. Instead of keeping that electricity inside the wires, it tracks to ground. And a lot of times it'll track to ground either directly to the ground, and it kind of looks like a lightning bolt, or it can track from the phases of the wiring back to the pole and come to ground that way. So essentially what a flashover does is it makes electricity go where you don't want it to. And it does that by tracking through the particulate matter or the carbon buildup within the smoke. And I'm sure you've all seen conditions where, light winds, heavy fuel loadings that could cause that. Equipment failure and interruption of service, that comes from obviously the electricity going where we don't want it to, and also by poles burning and the lines physically falling down, or the structures that it's supporting them being damaged. And then obviously risk of injury or death. Standing too close when a flashover occurs, there's a gradient that you can be involved in, and that electricity will essentially shock you. That's a problem. And then also the occurrence of the lines coming to the ground can create issues as well. This particular picture here is probably one of the scariest pictures I got to take within the last year. This is actually a 345,000 volt line that these gentlemen are working on. The line is energized. You can see all the trucks there and the crewmen. You can see the orange cones. That's one of the safety barriers to keep people away because of this line being energized. And this was actually a pole that we showed up and it was on fire. A couple of our trained local folks were able to put the base of it out, and we were able to secure it with these trucks before it came to ground. This is actually one of the more critical lines that we have. Losing this line, we probably would have put, 50,000 people in the dark. And so the enormity of this, pictures are worth 1,000 words, but when you're burning around assets, it doesn't matter if it's a substation, if it's a power line, the enormity of what can happen, words simply can't describe. So some of these, I got this stated as infrastructure damage. These particular lines, these are both in this case. The one on the right is a 345,000 volt line, like the one we looked at before that the guys worked hot. The line on the left is actually a 230 kV line where we had a catastrophic failure. When we got to this one, the reason we found the one on the left is because we took off in the airplane and we saw the smoke. Gentleman went out, threw a match, walked away from it. And until 230,000 volts went to ground and several hundred amps, We didn't know it was out of service. The one on the right, kind of see, can you guys all see that it's kind of green on the bottom of it? So during the burn season, we patrol these. And a lot of these we try to have on about a 1 week rotation for burning. And we've got an idea of where the burns are going to occur and where it's going to happen at. Well, this particular line, they had set the fire the morning of the patrol. We had an aerial patrol go through. They had set the fire that morning. 6 days later, when the patrol came through again, is when we found this structure. It had hung on for that long. And, you know, it doesn't look like that big of a deal. I mean, you guys, raise your hand if you think that's a big deal. Everybody should be raising their hand. Once again, you know, this line goes out, you know, your neighbors in the dark, you know, your Texas football games in the dark. So, yeah, kind of a big deal. And from this perspective, looking this way, I think we're looking west in this picture. But, you know, you think, well, if that falls down, the pole next to it will hold it. Well, what you don't see is the 1,100-foot span on the other way. We had the engineers run some numbers on this just to see, you know, theoretically what would happen if this structure would have gave way. We probably would have dropped 10 other structures with it. Once again, 345,000 volts going across the ground. And then on top of that, over the hills, a major state highway. So very, very scary when you think about it. Once again, here's a couple of smaller lines that we've got. One on the left obviously was discovered several days after the fire. That's one of our biggest challenges is with our territory being so large is a lot of our local resources, depending on where the structure's at, if it goes cross country, it's really hard for us to find these in a timely manner. And it's essentially a ticking time bomb out there. Picture on the right was incurred. You can see the cedars in the picture. Once again, this was a burn that occurred. There was no fire planning in place, no mitigation in place. Went out, got a nice southerly breeze, and the guy decided he was going to burn because it wasn't going to affect his house. Didn't really take into consideration what was happening on the neighbor's property. Didn't care about the neighbors across the road. Didn't care about the power line running through the middle of the property. And this one was, once again, this was a near miss. This one here was actually an instance where when our local agent showed up, one of the local firefighters was standing on top of a tank of water spraying onto the pole. Now this is 69,000 volts, but that's still a lot of electricity and not something you want to be spraying on. So very, very scary stuff. So kind of what I'm here today is, in not only for Westar Energy, but for your local utility, for your neighbor's utility. Be proactive, make a plan. You know what you're going to do ahead of time. We have several landowners within our region that own and operate and manage thousands of acres. And they're starting now to go out there and mow around the poles and do other things that they can do to mitigate those problems and not have issues. In our state, one thing that we've ran into with our Flint Hills ranchers is they've got a narrow time window of burning because of a smoke management plan. And I know the EPA is trying to work through some leeway with that, and regulatory-wise, they're trying to work some other stuff out. But still, when you only get a 30-day window to burn, it makes it very difficult. One thing that we've seen lately, we've seen an uptick in fall burning. And so, you know, we're kind of seeing how that's going to play out and how patch burning and some of these other prescribed methods are going to work out. But what we're really preaching is make a plan. You know, work with your local resources. You know, we've got what I'll say is the best university right out our back door here to help with that. And they put out a lot of good published material. And we just want to supplement that to just remember, hey, even though that stuff over your head, you know, it isn't yelling at you saying, I want to kill you. It's going to try to do that. It is dangerous. I don't want to undermine that. And it's just something that needs to be respected and planned for. So, you know, this is just one more component in your burn plan, right? You know, wind direction and everything else. We have one particular farmer that we have, or rancher, excuse me, that we have a line go through his property, and he has to wait for 3 different wind directions to burn his property completely. He does his back burn different from when he starts his head fire, and then he also goes out and he burns away from his neighbors to protect the power lines. So, it adds one more component of complexity possibly to your burn plan. But there are local resources and resources from our level and any utility from that matter that are available to help mitigate those problems. So with the burn plans, in these particular photos, I used a 345 volt 2-pole structure because these are the ones that scare me. I work around this stuff every day. I supervise roughly 50 people, and these are the lines that scare me. Picture on the left, you can see this gentleman goes out. He goes out ahead of time and burns around his poles. That's why you can tell the different shade color. The person in the middle there, just because of how his property lays, he does not burn around the pole assets. Now, with that, you can see the little cedar growing up down there. He hand cuts them. That's one thing we get asked all the time. Well, if we go out there and if we disc around them or if we mow around them or do some of this other stuff, some of these invasive species are going to be able to get in there. And, we're not here to tell anybody how to control their land. We're just asking you to protect yourself from these dangers. And so, we've got other folks that'll go out and they go Roundup through the middle of the year and spray Roundup on land that they're using for hay purposes. The picture above, once again, this is a gentleman who mows in a circular pattern, and they mow around it, and then also they have, you can tell where they've had cattle working around the pole to keep it away. So these are some of the options we recommend. I've got handouts. There's some out on the table out there. I've got some with me too. If you guys want to take them, they're available on our website as well. We just ask that the fuel load's reduced around the poles and kept away from it. One of the options is working the ground. Not really popular in the Flint Hills. I guess they got this stuff called Flint Rock or something. I don't know. And doesn't make a disc or a plow very happy. One thing to remember: never spray the equipment. If you guys got wind generators on your property and you have those little green boxes, don't spray them. Don't spray the poles. If a pole catches fire, it's already too late. Pole catches fire, that's a 911 situation. You need to be calling 911. They need to be getting a hold of the utility, and the professionals need to step in and take care of that. And everybody needs to stay away. Because if the pole's on fire, you don't know what the integrity is, and it doesn't take much to bring those to ground. So something to keep in mind. Obviously, using backburning or backfire techniques, there's landowners who will take and they'll actually go down the middle of the line. Got to have the right wind direction, and they'll go down between the poles and let it burn out of the way. That way, they're there when it's burnt, and they can tell that there's no pole fire issues or anything else. And then once they walk away from it, they don't have to worry about it burning up or getting any more fuel load into it. So a couple resources that are available. You have the flyers that I have out on the tables, or you can grab one from me. On our website is our material, and also the 1855 West Star 2. You call that number, you'll get me or you'll get one of my employees. We're there, we're a resource, In addition to that, the prescribed burning workshops, we're trying to get our education material out there. We know several other utilities are trying to do the same thing. And what it boils down to is the education part of it. Some of you may or may not be aware of the Power Line Protection Act. It kind of varies by state, but in a nutshell, this was put in place to keep folks who are operating equipment around power lines or working around power lines safe from utilities. It involves cover-up measures and stuff like that. What we don't want to see happen is new regulations come down on us. And when I say us, I'm a landowner too. I've got a 345,000 volt line running through the middle of my property, and I have to do stuff to protect it and to protect myself and to protect my coworkers. And back in 2014, when we had all this come up, we had folks that suggested that we enact regulations and tag on to this Power Line Protection Act. And that's been recommended, and we talked to regulators, and we said, hey, step back a minute here. Let us just get some educational stuff out there and try to integrate this in a different way than going down the regulatory path. So something to think about. If you're familiar with any of the states out west, Oregon probably has the most prolific act in place or statute right now. You can't burn within 75 feet of any power line, 230,000 volts and above. Well, for us in the state of Kansas, that would really impact our ranchers, Because if you take 75 feet either side of a structure and you times that by a couple hundred miles, you guys can figure out the lost revenue and the income involved with that type of regulation. And that's not something we want to see. So with that being said, I hope I didn't scare you too much. But like I said, make a plan, follow it. When in doubt, contact your utility. You got ITC was supposed to present today. They're a neighbor to us. We deal with them. We deal with OPPD and Nebraska NPPD, and then OG&E. So all of our neighbors we get to deal with, and we've all pretty much got the same message. We just may not get the platform to get it out there. So with that, are there any questions or anything? Purple shirt. So there are some utilities that actually use the metal sleeves that are about 2 foot in length above the ground line. The problem we run into is the integrity of the ground wires around those may or not be intact. If we got cattle rubbing on them and stuff like that, and that actually starts an arcing fire at the base of the poles. And so that's one thing we have not adopted on our system because of that concern. We as a utility have looked at that. We have looked at studies put out by Oregon State and some of the other universities who have suggested that, because I know it's very popular in the southeast, and it's just something that we have not adopted or don't feel is necessary at this time to mitigate that. When we have, if we're dealing with short grass on a consistent basis, such as you see in the swamp regions and stuff like that, it's one thing. But when we're dealing with grass that's taller than me, if you're not keeping that fire, the better part of 15, 20 feet away, it'll seriously impact you. Back in the back.
Out of curiosity, if someone's fire does catch one of your structures on fire and make it inoperable, that's something that you guys have considered or have litigated before?
So yes, so this goes back to the gentleman's question asked was, is there liability involved if you burn up a structure or have other impacts on the system? And the answer is yes. There can be, obviously internally, and every utility is different, but internally we hold an investigation. We had an event in 2015 where a gentleman going down the highway threw out a cigarette, burned up roughly 120 acres. Just so happened one of our lines happened to be in the way of that. Is that preventable? Not really. So could we, would we hold the landowner viable in that case or liable in that case? No. That's an exceptional event. That's what some would consider an act of God event. So, but there are other cases where, if a prescribed burn was put in place and performed, and one of our poles caught on fire or one of our assets was damaged, the landowner can be held liable. If the burn plan was followed, as long as everything was mitigated, and the investigation reveals that, it's all circumstantial from that perspective, because there's a lot of those but instances, and so that's why each one of them is looked at. We had these 22 events this year, and over $1 million in damages, and that's something that our customers pay for. If we're not able to be reimbursed or we don't pursue those claims. That doesn't include lost revenue. That doesn't include the impact on national security or anything else because the lights were out for somebody who needed it. That's just for damages that we incurred as part of labor and equipment and materials. Yes, sir.
Seems like, in my country down there, a lot of times under the power lines, all going on, that you all don't have that cost incurred in these areas where there's burning going on, because landowners taking care of your brush. So if you talk about the expenditures, you've got a lot less expenditures where these landowners are doing the prescribed fire. Perhaps some of that money that you're saving on right-of-way maintenance could be used for right-of-way maintenance at the poles and help these landowners out.
So we have a maintenance strategy in place that addresses that. We've got to take care of the components. We've got to take care of what we call ground line inspections, where we come through and we verify the integrity of the poles and everything else. And so we already have expenditures there. From a vegetation side, we're kind of unique in the state of Kansas because we don't have a lot of the forested areas, but we still go through, and there still are areas that we've got to go through and mow, try to control the cedars that are under our power lines that go through some of the wooded areas that aren't burned on a consistent basis. So we still do incur a cost for that. And with that, we've got a lot of landowners that don't want us there. You know, you don't want us showing up on your property. You know, they'd rather see out of sight, out of mind, and no, we'll go down this path and we'll take care of it, so we don't, you know, you don't have to show up. And so that's why that planning process is imperative.
From a prescribed fire perspective, you're so worried about maintaining your perimeter,
Right.
keeping your fire from escaping. It's
Yep.
sometimes difficult in the interior of a property. Not saying that you can't do it, but
Yep.
it's just one more big hassle.
Yeah.
One more big hurdle when
Yeah.
there's enough hurdles to prescribe fire use anyway. So
Mhm.
like some protection of those power poles would be in order.
Yep. And
Areas where prescribed fire would be.
yeah, and the poles are one thing, and you still got to remember the risk of the power going to ground and stuff becomes an issue too. One more.
Can you get an arc for your power line because of the smoke? I mean, I'm curious, because when we have power lines running through a burn that we're doing, I mean, we've told people to stay back, but how far can they actually arc, and how do you address that when you know it's there and you burn around the poles?
So we tell everybody to stay 100 feet from the line of fire, or from the closest phase, you know, depending, because of the configuration. We tell everybody 100 feet, and then that way you can stay out of that gradient. Where we get nervous is when you got firefighters and stuff chasing the fire line, and they're using that middle ground to hold it, and they're close, or they're right under the phasing. That's where it gets very dangerous.
Alrighty, thank you, Jason.
Thanks.